Really happy that Rabbi Goldin is joining us tonight, and I'm going to read his. It's like a really compact bio, but it's full of very prestigious positions. Rabbi Shmuel Goldin had served until recently as a spiritual leader of the Congregation Ahavath Torah in Englewood, New Jersey. He's the past president of the Rabbinical Council of America, past president of Rabbinical Alumni Yeshiva University, past president of the Rabbinical Council of Bergen County, and former chairman of its Kashruth Committee. Now that he made Aliyah 6 months ago, approximately 6 months ago, with his wife, he is the senior scholar for Nefesh B'Nefesh. So, well, it's a real treat. I didn't choose the title, but it is exactly what, and I hope it's exactly what Yiboneh is looking for in this title, and I'm sure that's only part of the reason you guys came. I'm sure it's really to hear Rabbi Goldin, no matter what he has to say. So without any further ado, Rabbi Goldin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Rabbi Goldin, thank you all for coming this evening. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to join you. Since coming to Eretz Yisrael, I've had an opportunity to hear a bit about the work of Yiboneh, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight. I'd like to start off with a true story from the Rabbinic, one of those stories, one of those experiences which the years in Smicha don't prepare you for. A couple of years into my tenure at Ahavath Torah in Englewood, New Jersey, I received a phone call. The individual at the other end of the line identified himself as a Korean Christian minister, a minister from Korea, representing, because Leonia, which is right near Englewood, has a very large Korean community, representing a group of Korean Christian ministers. And he said that we are involved in a comparative religion study, and we're going to different houses of worship, and we would like to come and visit your synagogue on a Sabbath morning to observe what happens. Now, immediately I became concerned, because for two reasons, practical reasons. Number one, I sort of wondered how my congregation of 500 people would react when all of a sudden 60 Korean Christian ministers walked in without warning. Secondly, I was concerned, and even more so, by what it was that the ministers would witness without warning on Shabbos morning in a modern Orthodox synagogue. The rabbi getting up and yelling for quiet, the children running up and down, the people out in the hallway, all of the various different things, the maladies that we have to fight in our modern Orthodox community. So I thought quickly and I said, I'll make you a deal. You can certainly come on a Shabbat morning, but first you have to come to the synagogue on a quiet morning when it's just me and you. And we'll sit down in the sanctuary, and I'll show you the sanctuary. I'll show you what the various different items in the sanctuary are about. I'll talk to you about the service. I'll explain what it is that you'll see. And then after that, we'll announce to the congregation that you're going to come, and we'll set a specific Shabbat when you will come, and everything will be fine. And sure enough, a week later, I found myself in the base medrash of Ahavath Torah in Englewood, New Jersey, with 60 Korean ministers standing in front of the Aron Kodesh. Now, I have to sort of back up and say that when you involve yourself in these kinds of discussions and you throw yourself open for questions, you've sort of got to expect anything, because you really don't know how other people perceive from the outside what it is you're doing. For example, many years earlier, I had spoken to a group of Catholic school children. And after making my presentation, I said to them, are there any questions? And one little girl raised her hand and said, yes, could you please explain what's the significance of the different colored skull caps? Does it indicate a hierarchy in the community? Now, I didn't explain that, yes, different skull caps do indicate different components of the Jewish community, but that's the kind of question you can get. So first I spoke to them, I showed them the Aron Kodesh, I explained to them what the Aron was, I showed them the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, I showed them what it was. spoke to them about the Torah, I explained what the sanctuary looked like, the men and women seating separately, and then I threw the floor open for questions. As I said, expecting, not knowing what to expect. Hand shot up. Where do you do the animal sacrifices? I said, what? They said, Rabbi, where do you do the animal sacrifices? So I took a deep breath and I said, okay, it is true that the Bible, the Torah, talks about the animal sacrifices, and this was done in the time of the temple, but now we have prayer, and prayer has replaced the sacrifices. They began to quote to me from psukim from Vayikra. In English, of course, they were saying, well, what about this? And how can you atone if you don't have the animal sacrifice? 45 minutes. They did not let this go. They did not let this go. And in fact, I was convinced that after those 45 minutes, they were still convinced that I had goats somewhere in the basement that I was hiding from them. And it was only later, when I began to really think about it, that I realized why they didn't let it go. These were fundamentalist Christian ministers. They had a very simple equation and a very simple belief. And that was that you don't relate to God directly. It's not possible. Man cannot relate to God in a direct fashion. There has to be an intermediary of some kind in between God and man. In the time of what they would refer to as the Old Testament, or in the time of our time, that intermediary, from their perception, was the karbanot, was the animal sacrifice, which eventually was replaced in Christian theology by the sacrifice of their God. And therefore, they could not possibly, no matter how often I said it, that we believe we relate to God directly, it destroyed their equation concerning not only Judaism, but concerning their own belief system. Because their own belief system was built upon this concept of Judaism believing the same thing, which is you can't relate to God directly. And it was an eye-opening experience for me, and one that I did not forget, as you can see, for many years. But I believe, and this is what we're going to talk about tonight a bit, that even we as Jews sometimes forget what it means when we talk about relating to God directly, and going even further than that, as we will soon see, and how our concept of Kedusha, our concept of sanctity, is a very unique concept that differs greatly from the common perception of holiness. And I'm going to show you this by returning to some of the first early moments of our history as a nation, past the patriarchal era, but during the period of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the period of the Exodus, and the period of entry into the land of Israel. At a time when our religious foundations as a nation are being formed and forged. And we will see that the Torah continues to repeat to us a message about spirituality, about significance and meaning, that we sometimes fail to note. Travel back with me to the first scene that's described on your handouts. It's a very familiar scene. It's one that very much played in our minds over the Pesach. Please, come on in. There are handouts over here. Very much played in our minds during the Pesach season. Sorry. And that is, this is the first moment of contact between God and the greatest Navi we have known. The contact between Moshe, Hashem, and Moshe. The Torah tells us, Vayar Hashem ki sar lirot. Moshe saw, in a distance, the burning bush. And in response, he moves aside to investigate. Now, just as an aside, it's very important. The Torah doesn't waste words. The Torah is telling us that had he not moved aside to investigate, God would not have spoken to him. So it's important for us to note that Moshe always takes the first step throughout his life. And had he not taken that step, who knows how Jewish history might have been different. Vayar Hashem kisar lirot, vayikro elav Elokim mitoch hasneh. And God calls to him from the bush. Vayomer hineni. And Moshe answers hineni. Vayomer al tikrav halom, shal na'alecha me'al raglecha, ki hamakom asher ata omed alav admas kodesh. He says, God says to Moshe, do not come near this bush. Take off your shoes from your feet, because the place where you stand upon is holy ground. Now, I know that this is familiar to us, but I want you to look at it as if you've never seen it before. Isn't it a bit disappointing that these are God's first words to Moshe? Let's understand this moment. I would expect that a Kodesh Baruch Hu would turn to Moshe and say, Moshe, do you know where you are? Do you know what's about to happen? Do you know the mission that I'm about to send you on? Oh, by the way, I'm God. Do you know the role that you're going to play in something momentous? This is the very first moment of communication between God and Moshe Rabbeinu. Take off your shoes. So most of the commentaries will explain that it is an important instruction. It's an important instruction in that this particular area where Moshe is now standing is Har Chorev, is Mount Sinai. And God is saying to Moshe, recognize the significance of this location, recognize the significance of this moment. You are to take off your shoes out of respect for this location. But many years ago, I read an interpretation by Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which changes everything. I'm taking it a bit further than he did, but it changes everything. He says, read those words again. Al tikrav halom, God says to Moshe. Don't come near the bush. Don't look for me in burning bushes. Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha, take off your shoes. Ki hamakom asher ata omed alav admas kodesh. Because the place where you stand, wherever that place may be, is potentially holy ground. And suddenly, the first instruction given by God to Moshe is not this esoteric idea of this is sanctified place, take off your shoes, but it's much more. In fact, it is the one instruction that captures, in a nutshell, the very mission upon which Moshe is about to embark. The concept of being Mekadesh Shem Shamayim. The concept of sanctifying God's name. The recognition that man's role in the world is not to experience sanctity, but to help create sanctity. And that our mission is to partner with God. Kadosh Baruch Hu, those who are mystically inclined will talk of God's tzimtzum, of God's withdrawal. But what that really means is that God gives us space in His world to become partners with Him in the creation of Kedusha. And therefore, what God is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu is, you're about to embark on a mission which will give rise to a people, which will give rise to a nation, whose fundamental task will be to create sanctity, to partner with me. And that is why I'm telling you, take off your shoes. Root yourself to this world, to this ground. Don't look for me elsewhere, because you'll find sanctity where you're standing. Fast forward. Fast forward to another familiar scene. The scene that takes place, that unfolds in about a year later, in the very same location. At this point, we're dealing with the birth of a nation. We're dealing with Matan Torah. We're dealing with the revelation. Now, again, one of the problems we have when it comes to the learning of Torah is that we learn things in 4th grade, we fix our understanding of them at that level, and we never return to question and to criticize or to critique, to recognize, to explore as adults what it is we learned. And here's a perfect example. The Torah is being given to Klal Yisrael. And the scene of Matan Torah is really defined by one particular commandment, the physical scene that God gives to the nation. It's the commandment known as Hagbolah, or the creation of a boundary. If you look at the 2nd section before you, the Torah says, V'higbalto es ha'om saviv lemor. Hishamru lachem alos bahar v'nogoa b'kotzeo, kol hanogea bahar mos yumas. And you shall create a boundary around the mountain, saying, don't touch the mountain, don't climb the mountain during Revelation. Anyone who touches the mountain is liable to death. Lo sigabo yad ki sakol yisakel o yoro yore. Now, as an aside, by the way, I remember when I first learned this, I assumed that what it meant was that if somebody touches the mountain, how would that person perish? Green lightning. Cecil B. DeMille's lightning would come strike the person. It's not what the Torah says, by the way. If someone touches the mountain, it's fascinating. It is the job of the community to carry out that sentence. Kisakol yisakel o yoro yore. Why? Because rooted at Sinai, and this is just an aside, is not just the giving of the law, but the launching of the judicial process. And therefore, God is saying, I'm giving you law, and you now have to use it, and you have to apply it. But one way or the other, this v'higbalto commandment is what actually sets the tone. Sets the tone, right? Because what it requires is that the nation is at the bottom of the mountain. God is speaking from its summit, above it. The Gemara says he doesn't come down to earth entirely, but he's above the mountain speaking. And Moshe ascends and descends. But then you ask yourself, why? Why did God command this commandment of Hagbolah? Why is it necessary for the nation to stay at the foot of the mountain at the time when the Torah is given? This is the moment of closest contact between God and man in history. Shouldn't that moment of contact be exemplified by nearness? Why does he insist that the nation stay at the foot of the mountain at the pain of death? So there are a variety of answers. There are those who will say that the nation could not have withstood the closeness to God. There are those who suggest, and this is very important, that this is the commandment that creates the balance between distance and familiarity that marks our relationship with God. Similar to the kind of distance and familiarity that marks a relationship to a teacher or to a parent, which is at once close but at the same time distant. But I would suggest to you that perhaps one of the important messages that emerges from here is the very same message that God gave to Moshe on that earlier occasion, which is he says to the nation, don't look for me in mists at the summit of Sinai. That's not where you're going to find me. You want to find me? Stay at the bottom of the mountain. Look into the eyes of your neighbor. Look into the chesed that you can perform. Accept the mitzvot that I'm giving you. I mean, that's really the message here. Take the commandments that I am giving to you and infuse them into your life, and that's where you'll find God. If you look for me in the mists, I'm not going to be there. You're going to find me down below. You're going to find me in your world, rooted to your world, obeying the law that I'm giving to you, and maintaining it and infusing it and weaving into your life. In fact, there is another section, which I should have put on the page here, which is just mind-boggling. And I'll just sort of summarize it for you. As this scene goes on, as the preparations for Sinai go on, God is ready to start the Ten Commandments, and to then, which really launches the revelation process. And the Torah tells us in the paragraph that God turns to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, please come up the mountain. So Moshe ascends the mountain, and no sooner does he get to the mountain, go take a look at this in the Chumash after my speech, because it's an amazing paragraph. As soon as Moshe ascends the mountain, God says to him, go down and tell the people not to climb the mountain. And Moshe Rabbeinu does something that's a little chutzpahdik. He says to God, you already told us that. You can almost hear him saying, Kadosh Baruch Hu, you just made me climb the mountain. Now you said, what's this busy? You're sending me immediately back down to tell them something that I already told them? I mean, that's my words, but that's really what he's saying. To which God responds in a way that I, as a child, promised myself I would never tell my children, because my parents always said it to me, because I told you so. Right? Which is what God says to Moshe. He doesn't explain. He says, Lech red, go down. Moshe goes down the mountain, tells the people, and what would you expect the next thing to happen would be? What's going to happen next? Moshe is going to go back up. As soon as Moshe hits the bottom of the mountain and tells the nation, you know what happens in the next sentence? Anochi Hashem Elokech, God begins revelation. And you can almost see Moshe Rabbeinu go, wait a minute, God, I'm supposed to be up there. But that's not the answer. This is one of those occasions where God teaches Moshe not by telling him something, but by teaching him by saying, this is something you should realize yourself. When revelation begins, where do you belong, Moshe? With the people. There will be a time when you will come back up. There will be a time when you will assume that role and of teacher. But when revelation begins, when Matan Torah begins, you belong with the nation. And I'm not going to tell it to you, I'm going to let you learn it yourself. And there are 2 or 3 occasions like this where HaKadosh Baruch Hu, instead of directly saying something to Moshe, causes him to learn the lesson, because the lesson is so important, he wants Moshe to realize it for himself. So there's the second occasion, right? Where Kadosh Baruch Hu is saying now to the nation what he has said, according to Hirsch, to Moshe individually, which is, don't look for me in those mists. Find me in your world. Find me where you are. Let's go to the next section. Next section, God then commands the creation of a Mishkan. Right? The Mishkan is the portable sanctuary that is to be carried around with the nation through the desert. But the theme pasuk that launches the creation of the Mishkan is the third pasuk, is the third passage on your page. V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'socham. And they will create, tell the nation, God says to Moshe, that they will create a mikdash, a holy place, and I will dwell within them. So most commentaries focus on the last part of the sentence, because they say it actually teaches a tremendously important lesson. It should have said, one would have thought, V'shachanti b'tocha, I will dwell within it. Let them create a Mishkan. It says, I will dwell within them. So Pashat Pshat means I will dwell within them in the encampment. Others suggest it means I will dwell in their hearts. I will dwell within the people. But one of the commentaries, the Orach Chaim, asks a different question. He says the word mikdash here, this is the only time in the Torah where the Mishkan is referred to not by its specific name, but by a generic name. The specific name is Mishkan. That's what that edifice was. It was a mikdash, it was a holy place, but it was the Mishkan, it was the portable sanctuary. Why doesn't the Torah say, V'asu li Mishkan v'shachanti b'tocham? Why does it say, V'asu li mikdash? So, the Archaim gives two answers. The first, extremely important, is that this is a tzivui ledorot. This is a commandment not simply concerning the Mishkan, but it's a commandment concerning the Beit HaMikdash that will eventually be built. The Mishkan is the precursor of the temple in Jerusalem. So when the Torah says, V'asu li mikdash, he's commanding us to build the mikdash whenever we can. But then the Or HaChaim says something else, and it's brilliant. He says, when would you expect the sanctuary to become holy? I would expect the sanctuary to become holy once God invests his presence within it. Says the Or HaChaim, that's not what the Torah says. The Torah says, V'asu li mikdash. To quote the Or HaChaim, Miyad she'osim oto lishmo yitbarach miyad hu mikdash v'din kodesh yeshla. From the moment you create it, according to my commandments, it becomes a mikdash. From that moment. It becomes holy when you invest your efforts in fulfilling my will. And therefore, this building that you're expecting me to sanctify, God says, no, I'm not sanctifying it. You are. You create it. As soon as you create it, according to my specifications, it is a mikdash. And once again, holiness becomes something that is not created by a Kadosh Baruch Hu in isolation in some mystical way, but is created by the efforts of man, following God's will in a practical and concrete way in the world. But now let's go to the last example. One which is close to all of our hearts because we're all here. And that is, of course, the sanctification of the land of Israel. Let me ask you a question before you even look at this last section. When did the land of Israel become sanctified? At what point in Jewish history did the land of Israel become sanctified? I'll tell you what I had always thought before I learned the truth. From time immemorial, from the moment of creation. Right? After all, the first Rashi on the Torah says, why does the Torah begin with the creation narrative? To tell us that God is creating the world and Eretz Yisrael is ours. I would have thought it was sanctified from the moment God created it. It's the center of the world. We have all of those medrashim which talk about the land of Israel being the center of the world, being the sanctified place in the world, being the portal to Kedusha. At the very least, I would have thought that when God turns to Avram Avinu, to Abraham, and says, Abraham, lech lecho me'artzecho mi'moladetecho, at that point the land is sanctified. Halachically, that is not true. Halachically, on a very strict halachic level, the land becomes sanctified on two occasions in Jewish history. One in a temporal fashion, and one in perpetuity. What's the first occasion? Joshua. The first occasion of the sanctification of the land of Israel, referred to in the Talmud as Kedusha Rishonah, as the first sanctification, is when Joshua leads the nation of Israel as a people, as a nation, for the first time into the land. That creates Kedusha Rishonah. Excuse me? I'll get to that. That's correct. That's correct. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the Kedusha Rishonah, that first sanctification is a sanctification that occurs when Joshua enters with the people, with the newly formed nation of Israel after the death of Moshe. Now, this gentleman, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Amir.
Amir. So Amir mentions that there is actually a dispute in the Talmud concerning that first sanctification. Is that first sanctification in perpetuity, or does it dissipate upon Golus Bavel? And let me explain. Let's look at Jewish history for a minute. We enter the land under Joshua. We create the first Jewish commonwealth after the period of the judges, and I'm pushing Jewish history into a nutshell here. We then divide. We have a kingdom under David and Shaul, David and Shlomo, which is a united kingdom. We then divide into two kingdoms. 10 tribes are exiled. And then finally, Babylon exiles the remaining Jews, Yehuda. That's why we're all Jews, because we're descendants of the kingdom of Yehuda. When we are exiled from the land, the rabbis ask, does the Kedusha Rishona dissipate or does it remain? And the Rambam, which you have on your page, both on the bottom paragraph and the next page, holds, as do most authorities, that sanctification dissipates. That when the Jewish nation leaves, the sanctification disappears, except for the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is unique and dealt with differently. When does the land become sanctified a second time?
On resettlements.
When 70 years later, at the end of Golus Bavel, what happens is, and by the way, Golus Bavel, and this is just a bit of a history comment, the exile into Babylon is an extremely important period in Jewish history, because it is the first time that we as a nation break the rule. And that is that we are an exiled people that survive as an exiled people, retain our identity, and return to the land. 70 years after the destruction of the temple, Cyrus the Great, with some fudge factor here, Cyrus the Great, who is the king of Persia, conquers Babylon and says, "Fine, you guys can go back. You can now go back to the land of Israel. You can resettle. You want to build your temple, go ahead." How many Jews return?
10%.
Not even. Less than 10%. After 60, 70 years of crying and saying, Al Naharos Bavel, Sham Yashav Gam Bachinu, right there by the rivers of Babylon, there we cried, there we sat, we wept, Shira Malos Beshuv Hashem et Shivat Zionon Yinu Kacholmim. Wonderful words. Cyrus the Great says you can go back. Over 90% of the Israelites say, thanks, but no thanks. Why? Why? Because it's great in Bavel. It's comfortable. The same reason that my community in Englewood didn't come. The same reason I didn't come for a whole till now. Right? It's comfortable where you are. Less than 10% return. Under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, rebuild the temple. It's a quiet returning. They begin to reestablish. They begin to spread out. That's Kedusha Shniya. That's the second sanctification of the land. And say the rabbis, Kedusha Shniya, Kidsha L'Shata U'Kidsha La'atid Lavo. That second sanctification, the one that occurred on that when that remnant, and wasn't this bold conquest, but it was the struggle to return and to reestablish. And if you take a look at the second page, you'll see that the Rambam, in the second page, take a look at the second underlined section. The Kevan Ezra v'Kitsha lo Kitsha b'kibush elo b'chazaka. Ezra did not sanctify the land through conquest, but through chazaka. What does chazaka mean? It means through the establishment, through holding on to, through the acquisition, became yours. Shechziku bo. Lefichach kol makom shechziku bo ole Bavel. And this is an important halacha, by the way. It has to do, for example, with Masrot. It has to do with the taking of Maser. It has to do with the only places that are considered sanctified land are the places where those who came back from Bavel lived, where they established communities, where they began to thrive again. And therefore, certain areas of Israel, like Beit Shan, others are not necessarily within those boundaries and are not considered from a halachic perspective for the purpose of mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, are not considered part of the Israel, the country of Israel. But again, we're not in a halachic mode route in that regard, but it's an important piece. So think of what we're saying. The land chosen by God is not sanctified until we become partners. And it isn't even sanctified until that partnership emanates primarily from us without his commandment. Let's understand there's a fundamental difference between the conquest of the land under Joshua. God's still talking. When we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, we're at the end of the prophetic era. Jews are making their own decisions. People are starting to, this is the time when God weans us away from direct prophecy. It's right on the cusp of that period. And we're entering the non-prophetic era where the Israelites have to find their own way back. And what is Hashem saying? It's when you find your way and when you decide to be partners with me in the conquest, the acquisition of the land, and you are machzik ba, and you make it yours, that's when it becomes kadosh. That's when it becomes sanctified. And for anybody who in our time wants to think about what it means to have the zchus to be in Eretz Yisrael and to play a role in that regard, this is where we're at. This is what we're talking about. There's a pattern here. It's a clear pattern. It's a pattern that we often miss. It's a pattern that says that sanctity is created by the direct relationship and partnership between man and God in this world in a practical way. And I tell you that as a rabbi who has served in the rabbinate for many years, it is a truth that we, in our time, sorely miss. We live in a time of instant, not just gratification, but instant everything. Instant everything. You push a button. I remember my mother made Aliyah. The last 10 years of her life, she was a teacher all her life. She made Aliyah. She lived here in the Tamir. One day she calls me up and she says, Shmuel, do you know what you can find on Google? All right? I mean, instant. And by the way, for good and for bad. You can find anything, and also you become an instant scholar, or you think you become an instant scholar, right? How scholarship now is defined by whether you have a blog, and whether that blog is read by how many people read the blog, and that makes you suddenly an authority on everything from the peace process to who knows what. That instant aspect of scholarship, of knowledge, of everything, has seeped into the quest for spirituality as well. People want instant spirituality. How many times have I heard from members of my community and others, Rabbi, we want to be moved. We want to walk into the synagogue, and we want the synagogue to somehow create spirituality. I can come late. I don't have to get there early. I don't have to get there on time necessarily. I can sit and talk to my neighbor through most of the davening, but somehow it doesn't create spirituality for me. The rabbis tell us the Hasidim Rishonim, when did they get to shul? An hour before davening. An hour before davening, they would get to shul and they would sit down and they would meditate. And they would think about who they were going to talk to. Because you can't just shut off the world and all of a sudden become spiritual. The red bendel that you get at the kotel is not going to create spirituality. Spirituality in Jewish life is hard work. I speak for myself. I'm a Litvak, which means that my family comes from Lithuania. That means that we're cerebral. We have trouble when it comes to the emotions. It's hard. I find davening very hard. It's very difficult. How do you relate to a God? So I find that my answer has to be, I have to work at it. I have to study. I have to read books about tefillah. I have to read books about what it means to believe in God and why I believe in God. And how that you have to invest the time, you have to invest the effort. Spirituality is created by the partnership between man and God. And it is only when and if we invest that effort, we will find spirituality in acts of Chesed. We will find spirituality in Shabbat, properly observed. We will find spirituality if Shabbat is not just a bunch of laws, but is a zemer at the table. If it's time spent with family. I've often said to my community and others that the laws of Shabbat create the circumference of a circle. But how you fill in that circle, the investment you place in making Shabbat a different day, a day of thought, a day of study, a day of spending with family, a day of discussion. How often do we sit and talk to our children? These are aspects of Kedusha that are created by us through hard effort and cannot be reached without that effort. So the message that emerges from the fundamental pieces that are before us is really a very startling one. To those ministers who are probably think that I have goats in the basement, that's not spirituality. And bringing the karbanot to the mikdash alone was not spirituality either. The karbanot were shared meals with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Most of them were eaten. It's another topic to discuss, how to view karbanot. But they were an opportunity to draw closer to God. They were an opportunity to invest time, invest effort, invest what was important to you in that relationship. One of my favorite stories tells of a man whose task it is to stand outside of a minimum security prison camp in the Soviet Union before the fall of the Soviet Union. And the way this prison camp works is that the prisoners work in the camp during the day and sleep off grounds at night. And it's the job of this particular guard to make sure that nobody steals anything when they're leaving the camp, that no camp material is taken. So the first day, the guard notices one particular inmate. This inmate wheels out a wheelbarrow full of straw. The guard stops the men, empties out the wheelbarrow, nothing in the straw, looks at the wheelbarrow, looks top, bottom, nothing, lets him go. Next day, inmate wheels out a wheelbarrow full of straw. Looks at it again, examines it again, same thing. Day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out, for 30 years. This same tekes takes place. And finally, at the end of 30 years, the guard turns to the prisoner and says, listen, I'm about to retire. And I promise you that your secret is safe with me. But it's going to bother me for the rest of my life. Can you please tell me why, for the last 30 years, you've been stealing straw? The guy looks at him with a glimmer in his eye and says, you still don't get it. For 30 years, I've been stealing wheelbarrows. Right? A scene can become so familiar to us that we fail to see the reality. The Torah is telling us that we can't find God in the clouds. We find him here in this world. And that's a message that should ring true for us all. Thank you. Questions? Yes. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Yes.
Given that the Kedusha is dependent on man's behavior and our acceptance of Hashem and the mitzvah, how did we end up with the concept of perpetual sanctification?
Excellent question. In other words, how do we end up with perpetual sanctification should be renewed each time that we come back?
Because we're not,
Or it should not be perpetual.
we're not reliable.
That's right, we're not reliable. Right. So the answer is, it would seem, again, I'm not sure that I have an answer, but I think the seed to the answer is what you said, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows us the gift of creating a perpetually sanctified location when we finally reach the point when we actually meet that challenge. And we did it, it's sanctified, and it will continue to be sanctified because we met that challenge at that particular moment. Now, it's interesting. I believe that such perpetual sanctification can only be created in Eretz Yisrael. We've never had an example of perpetual sanctification created outside the land. So it's, in a sense, God saying, if once you sanctify this location, because it's chosen, I will allow it to become perpetually sanctified. But then all other efforts will be temporal in nature. And I think had he not allowed that perpetual nature, you're right, we're not reliable, and who knows what would have happened. The very fact that he allowed Israel to become perpetually sanctified is part of what kept us alive throughout Golos, because we look back to that
But
Kedusha.
that feeds into zealots amongst us today who would argue that there is an integral Kedusha in the land.
Well, the question is, what does Kedusha mean? All right, does that give you the license to do anything you want? No, it means, yes, there is Kedusha in this land. It was created by our ancestors in partnership with God. That doesn't give me license to behave differently. It gives me license to earn the right to share in that Kedusha in this day. But how people react to the reality is not a comment on the reality. It's a comment on how people are reacting.
And to just add, I think there is a significant difference, qualitative difference between war and, I'm going to use a word, it's not a dirty word, settlement. Meaning war may be dirty and settlement is not.
Well, the concept of chazaka is, but I'm not going to get political, right? But yes.
Was the Kedusha of the Kotel re-energized or augmented 50 years ago when it was liberated by the Jewish soldiers?
Very good question. The answer is that the Kedusha of Har HaBayit and of Yerushalayim, everyone agrees, became perpetual with the first sanctification. When David conquers Yerushalayim and when Shlomo builds the Beis HaMikdash, that sanctification is the exception. And that sanctification remained in perpetuity. So it was already sanctified, it was reclaimed, perhaps is the best way to put it, when the soldiers came back. Questions? All right. Thank you very much, everybody. And